The fields before the ranch, once green with corn and wheat, now lay bare with nothing but stubble. Weeds grew knee-high, swaying in the early summer wind, their rustle carrying a mournful sound. The wooden house, its shingles once bright beneath the sun, was now scarred with holes. Window frames rattled in the wind, as though they might break free from their hinges. Clara Monroe stood there alone, her worn dress dust-stained at the hem, both hands clasped tight before her stomach, as if to hold on to the last fragile piece of life she still possessed. Before her lay the ranch where she had grown up, the place her parents had worked themselves to exhaustion to build. Now all that remained was emptiness, the trace of a life stripped away. Silas Granger, the man who had once sworn to walk with her until the end, had left the winter before. He hadn't only abandoned Clara, he had taken with him most of the cattle, much of the land, and the dignity she once carried. The court in Redemption Ridge sided with him, for Silas had grown rich with cunning tricks, while Clara was nothing more than a black woman standing alone. Folks said, "Heaven does not favor the weak," and for Clara no words had ever cut so deep. Whispers trailed her each time she went into town for salt or flour. The wives at the mercantile would snicker, a failed widow, couldn't keep her husband, couldn't keep her land. The men made no effort to hide their disdain. One even laughed aloud. "That ranch'll turn to dust soon enough. She's only making it harder on herself." Clara heard it all, but she never answered back. She only returned home, where rain slipped through holes in the roof into wooden pails, and told herself that no one could ever understand why she clung to this place, because it was not only land, it was the blood and sweat of her father, the steady hands of her mother. It was the ground where her bare feet once raced in sunlight, the cabin where her mother lit the oil lamp on winter nights and smiled as Clara read her first words. To sell it and walk away would be to betray her very roots. But keeping it meant facing hardship, loneliness, and the harsh eyes of a town that wished her gone. That conflict gnawed at her, weighing her shoulders like stone. By day, she patched fences and planted rows of vegetables just to get by. By night, when the wind clawed through the cracks of the cabin, she curled beneath a frayed blanket, eyes wide in the dark, asking herself if she had enough strength left. At times, in moments of weakness, she wished she had gone with Silas, though she knew he had never truly loved her. Yet each time she thought of her father's plow in the earth, of her mother's sweat wiped from her brow, Clara sat upright, her heart pulled taut by a defiance she could not silence. That day, the wind blew stronger than usual. Clouds smothered the sun, making the house before her seem all the more broken. Clara stepped slowly onto the porch, her eyes tracing the cracks along the wooden walls, the squeal of the hinges, and she felt suddenly small. She sat on the steps, calloused hands covering her face. Tears refused to fall, pressing instead against her throat like a stone lodged deep. She collapsed, her head against the door darkened by years of weather. Her body shook as though she were a child left alone in a crowded fairground. In that moment, Clara felt the whole world had turned its back on her. Then, through a break in the clouds, sunset light spilled across the land. A rim of gold circled her shadow where she sat. Slowly, Clara lifted her head, her eyes dry. The ranch was still battered and weary, but in the fire of evening it looked cloaked in gold. She drew in a long breath, straightened her back. Her hands trembled, her chest ached, but she knew she could not surrender. Not today, not ever. The sunset held on her face like a vow. She might falter, but she would never vanish. And from that moment on, her story began. The dirt road from Redemption Ridge back to Clara's ranch was narrow and winding, weeds pushing into the ruts left by old wagon wheels. After a long day hauling water, Clara dragged her steps, the wooden bucket heavy on her shoulder, dampening her dress with sweat. The harsh afternoon sun had eased, but the western dust wind still stung her face, burning her eyes. That was when she saw him. A man lay sprawled in the roadside dirt, half his body buried in dust. His black horse had bolted, leaving only a saddle overturned on the ground, reins tangled. Clara froze, her eyes wide. Who was he? Why here? She set the bucket down quickly, her heartbeat racing beyond control. The man's breath came ragged, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. His shirt was torn and darkened with blood at the side. His face was weathered by sun, rough with an unshaven beard, his body marked with bruises fresh and harsh. His right arm hung slack, his large hand still gripping a revolver that had slipped from its holster. Clara stepped back. In this land, a stranger collapsed on the road brought more trouble than mercy. Taking him home might mean inviting a wolf into the fold. But then his eyelids flickered. For an instant, she caught the color of ash-gray eyes, weary yet burning with a desperate hold on life. His lips moved in a broken sound before his body went slack again. Clara bit down on her lip. She thought of her parents, who had never turned away anyone desperate at their door. Her heart pounded. Reason told her to leave, but instinct refused. She knelt beside him, her hand trembling as it pressed against his shoulder. His skin burned hot beneath her touch, slick with sweat and dust. Blood had soaked through half his shirt. Clara glanced up and around. The road was empty, nothing but dry grass leaning in the wind, and a few black crows rasping from a far-off tree. Without giving herself more time to think, she slipped her arms beneath his back and heaved. His body was heavy as stone, but years of labor lent her strength. Inch by inch, she dragged him to her small wagon, propped his head against a bundle of hay. The road home stretched twice as long. Each jolt of the wheels sent a spasm across his face, fresh blood seeping through cloth. Clara's hands shook on the reins, but her gaze stayed fixed ahead. Inside the worn cabin, she lowered him onto the old bed. Evening light crept through the window, casting across the scars that marked his chest and shoulder. What battles had carved that flesh? Clara hurried to heat water, to gather clean strips of cloth. Pulling his shirt aside, she found the wound. A long gash along his side, blood-crusted dark. The stench turned her stomach, but she steadied her hand. She pressed clean cloth to the wound. The man shot upright on reflex, his arm striking out, rough hand clamping around her wrist. His eyes flew open, gray, sharp as steel. They froze. Clara's breath came quick, her hand trembling in his grip for a moment she thought he might crush her bones. But then, as if something dawned on him, he eased his hold, suspicion still there but muted. She said nothing, only bent back to her work. She washed the blood, then stitched the wound with the crude skill her father had once taught her. Each pass of the needle pulled a twitch from his muscles, dragged a heavy breath from his chest. Sweat rolled down Clara's temple, dripping onto his skin. His eyes flicked up, catching her face set with grim resolve. Their gazes locked, one full of guarded mistrust, the other bound by quiet steadiness. The room was thick with silence, broken only by the thread passing flesh and his strained breathing. When it was done, Clara pulled a frayed blanket over him. She stepped back, hands trembling, blood still streaked across her fingers, his eyes cracked open, his lips shaped broken words, swallowed by weakness. He looked at her, and in that look lay a shadow she could not name. Clara shivered. The scars etched into his body told enough, the slash across his shoulder, an old bullet wound on his chest, the deep seam running down his arm. These were not the marks of farmer or miner. They were the map of a life lived on the edge of danger, a man who had crossed death's line too many times. His name, though she did not yet know it, was Jonah Whittaker. He did not need to speak for Clara to sense the weight of a history carved into him, dark and unyielding. She sat on the chair beside the bed, her heart pressed down by the weight of stone. She did not know what the morning would bring when he woke, whether he would thank her, curse her, or worse. But tonight, at least, she had not turned her back. Outside, the night wind screamed through the cracks in the wood, carrying the far-off cry of wolves. Clara shivered, then stilled herself by the faint glow of the oil lamp, waiting for the awakening of the stranger fate had set at her threshold. In the days that followed, the wooden house, once cold and hollow, began to carry new sounds. The strike of hammer against nail, the thud of boards falling into place, the steady tread of boots pressing down hard earth, all of it rose and fell with the breath of the prairie. Jonah Whittaker, the man Clara had once hesitated to save, now stood in the backyard, broad shoulders slick with sweat as he worked to mend the rotting stables. From a distance, Clara watched, her hands still dusty from the row of seeds she had just planted. Part of her stayed wary, reminding her that he was still a stranger, carrying a past she could not yet see clearly. But another part, buried deep, felt the faint relief of knowing that for the first time in months, the burdens of ranch life no longer pressed down on her alone. That noon, they lifted a heavy plank together. Clara took the front, Jonah the back. The board sagged under its own weight, shifting until their hands brushed. It lasted only an instant, but a current jolted up Clara's arm. She pulled back on reflex, her heart skipping, yet she could not hide the look in her eyes when they flicked toward him. Jonah gave no word, only a slight nod, as if to admit that the touch was not chance, and not something to be feared either. By late afternoon, they stood beneath the new rafters of the stable, the crossbeam finally braced upright. Their eyes met again. Not long, not fierce, but enough for Clara to feel a warmth slip quietly into the cold hollow of her chest. But Redemption Ridge was never a place that left folks in peace. Gossip ran faster than prairie wind. At the market, when Clara carried her basket of greens to trade for salt, she felt the stares burn into her back. "A widow and a drifter," someone muttered with a dry laugh. Clara heard it clear, her cheeks flushing hot, fingers tightening around the handle until her knuckles whitened. Jonah walked beside her. He said nothing. He did not glance back. His face stayed steady, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if the words behind them had never been spoken. That quiet certainty let Clara draw a slow breath. No arguments, no defenses, just the fact that he chose to walk with her beneath those sharp eyes was enough. That night, a sudden rain came down. The two of them dashed from the stable to the porch, clothes soaked through. Clara dropped into a chair, lungs heaving, and then, without warning, laughter burst from her lips at the sight of Jonah fumbling to shake water from his hair. The sound rang sharp and bright, cracking open a place in her that had forgotten joy. Jonah lifted his gaze, ash-gray eyes softening, as if holding on to the sound like a thing too rare to let slip away. In that moment, Clara understood something was stirring, quiet as a seed buried beneath damp soil, unseen, but rooted all the same. Yet when night fell, she still sat at her mother's old desk, oil lamp throwing a long shadow against the wall. She opened the small notebook and wrote a single line: "I must remain cautious, but at least I am no longer entirely alone." Outside, the night wind hummed across the plains. Inside, silence no longer pressed down heavy. It now carried the rhythm of a hammer striking, the sound of boots across the floor, and every so often, the lingering weight of a glance that lasted longer than it needed to. Morning at Redemption Ridge began as it always did. Clara Monroe bent low over the rows of young shoots in her garden, her hands damp with dew, when the sound of pounding hooves carried from the distance. At first, she thought it must be a neighbor passing through, but when she lifted her head toward the dirt road that led to her ranch, her chest tightened hard. 3 horses cut through the dust. At the front rode a figure Clara never wished to see again: Silas Granger. He sat high in the saddle, his long coat whipping in the wind, a smug grin visible even from afar. Beside him rode a man in a gray vest, spectacles slipping down his nose, clutching a stack of papers. A lawyer. The hoe slipped from Clara's grip and fell into the dirt. Her knees almost weakened as memories struck like a poisoned wind. The day Silas signed the divorce, the court that stripped her land, the moment she became the town's cruelest joke. The horses halted before the porch. Silas dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the patched roof, the new fencing, then fixing on Clara. That look, half scorn, half triumph, struck deeper than any words. "Clara," he drawled, letting her name drip like syrup. "You've done better than I expected, but this land won't be yours for long." The lawyer cleared his throat and unfurled the papers. "By prior ownership agreements and rights to the underground water source, my client has lawful claim to this property." Clara's face drained of color. She stumbled back a step, her hands trembling. The eastern spring was the one thing keeping the ranch alive. Without it, she would have nothing. His words struck like a death sentence. Her mouth opened, but her throat closed tight. No sound came. From the cabin door came the creak of hinges. Jonah Whitaker stepped out. He did not rush. He strode with steady weight, gray eyes locked on Silas. No introduction was needed. His presence alone thickened the air. Jonah stopped at Clara's side. He did not touch her, but stood close enough that she felt the warmth radiating from his frame. His gaze was iron, steady, unflinching against Silas. "Who is he?" the lawyer asked, uncertain, turning to Silas. Silas snorted. "A drifter." Clara always had a soft spot for strays. Jonah made no answer. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, but the tension in his arms spoke readiness. Clara glanced toward him, her heart hammering. Yet for the first time in years, the panic inside her eased, because she was not standing alone. Silas stepped forward, pulling a paper with a red seal from his coat, thrusting it at Clara. "If you're smart, you'll sign. Take the money, leave this shack behind, and let me handle what comes next. Otherwise—" He paused, his eyes sliding toward Jonah. "We'll let the courts decide. And you know the courts have never favored you." A tremor ran through Clara's legs. Images of judges with cold eyes, of whispered prejudice in the courtroom, surged back. Her mouth opened, but her voice failed her. That was when Jonah spoke, His voice came low and rough, like stone dragged across steel. "She won't sign." Both Clara and Silas snapped their eyes toward him. Jonah's gaze was locked on Silas, unblinking, hard as frost. "This land is hers. Anyone who wants to take it will have to go through me first." Silence stretched, the kind that holds its breath. Wind swept grit across the yard, tugging at their coats. Clara stood between them, her heart pounding, but her breath came steadier. Jonah's words rose behind her like a wall against the storm. Silas broke into laughter, sharp and brittle. "You've chosen well, Clara. But tell me, how long can a man hiding behind scars keep you safe? Soon enough, the whole town will side with me again." He waved his hand at the lawyer, then swung into the saddle. "We'll meet again in court." The thunder of hooves receded, leaving only a haze of dust that hung in the air. Clara still trembled, but when she turned toward Jonah, she found his gaze steady, unwavering. A single nod from him was enough to steady her legs. The fear had not vanished. The battle was only beginning. But Clara knew one thing for certain now. She was no longer alone. Evening light spilled across the ranch, casting long shadows. Side by side, two figures stood on the porch, their silhouettes joined against the past that had come riding back to claim them. Nights in Redemption Ridge were often hushed, broken only by the rasp of insects in the tall grass and the whistle of wind slipping through the gaps of weathered boards. Clara Monroe sat on the porch, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the dark stretch of fields. Since the day Silas had returned with his lawyer, unease had settled into her chest and refused to leave. Inside, Jonah Whitaker had doused the lamps, but Clara knew he had not gone to sleep. She could hear his heavy, deliberate steps pacing the house, as if he were listening for the slightest disturbance. Perhaps he too felt the tension that clung to the air, like smoke before a storm. Then, sudden and sharp, came the acrid smell of burning. Clara's head snapped up, her spine turned to ice. In the next breath, a fierce glow split the night. At the edge of the yard, the stable erupted in flames, fire clawing up the dry boards, crackling like mad laughter in the dark. "Fire, Jonah!" Clara's cry broke raw from her throat. Jonah burst through the doorway without hesitation. He caught Clara's arm, pulling her back from the porch, before charging straight into the blaze. Clara reached for him, but her hand clutched at nothing. The tall figure had already disappeared into smoke and fire. Heat roared against her face, searing her skin. Inside, the terrified screams of horses rose high, piercing. Jonah's frame vanished through the broken door, swallowed whole by smoke. Clara screamed his name, but the wind and fire devoured her voice. She gripped the porch rail until her palms bled, every second stretched unbearable. Then, through the haze, Jonah emerged. He hauled a panicked stallion by the reins, the beast thrashing, eyes wild with terror. Flames licked Jonah's back, but his grip held firm, his voice rising in a sharp command that cut through the roar. The horse bolted free into the yard, where Clara seized the reins and dragged it to safety. Jonah turned back. Before Clara could stop him, he plunged into the inferno again. Her scream cracked into sobs, but he did not falter. Moments later, he stumbled out, dragging a trembling mare, its flank raw with burns. The stable groaned, timbers snapping. Jonah vanished toward the door once more, but before Clara could move, the roof caved with a savage roar. She ran forward, terror consuming her, when suddenly an iron arm wrapped around her waist. Jonah, soot-streaked, coughing, alive, pulled her back just as the stable collapsed in a storm of sparks. The night lit red, fire swallowing the structure whole. They fell hard into the dirt. Clara lay in his arms, lungs gasping against the suffocating smoke. Jonah hacked and coughed, his face blackened, his eyes bloodshot from the sting of ash. Yet in them burned that same hard light, steady and unbroken. For a long while neither moved. Only the blaze spoke, roaring high into the sky, its glow mocking their loss. Clara trembled, her hand reaching blindly until it found Jonah's. His palm was rough, scarred, and for a moment he might have pulled away. But instead, his fingers closed around hers, firm, grounding, a silent vow. Tears spilled hot down Clara's face. She turned to him, her voice raw, almost a whisper. "I cannot lose everything again." The words tore from a place deeper than memory. Losing her parents, her honor, her land, her trust. She could not speak further, but Jonah understood. His grip tightened. His gaze shifted toward the fire devouring what little she had left. His jaw set, as though to swear an oath without sound. The flames cast their glow across the porch, painting long shadows of two figures side by side in the ash. A woman stripped of nearly all she once held, and a man carrying a past heavy with scars, but who had run into fire to save what could be saved. The night wind lifted sparks into the sky, scattering them like dying stars. They clung to Clara's hair damp with sweat, to Jonah's soot-streaked shoulders. Yet in the midst of ruin, something fragile had taken hold, thin as a green shoot breaking through charred ground, but stronger than the fire that had tried to claim it. Ash from the fire still drifted on the night wind. The narrow porch was coated in a thin gray dust, but on the steps 2 figures remained, their breathing still rough from smoke. Clara Monroe clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders, her hand trembling even after Jonah had pulled her clear of the blaze. Beside her, he sat silent, his ash-gray eyes reddened from smoke but steady, glowing with a quiet fire of their own, calm, unyielding, impossible to extinguish. They did not speak. Only Clara's heart beat fast, her hand still held firmly in Jonah's. His grip was neither crushing nor loose, yet it was enough. In that silence, Clara felt her body finally stop shaking. The fire had stolen the stable, had burned away days of toil, but it had also consumed the fragile space that once kept them apart. When the night wind grew colder, Jonah tipped his head toward the cabin door, his eyes giving an unspoken invitation. Clara hesitated, then rose to follow, her hand still resting in his. Inside the small room, the fire in the hearth glowed and danced against the wooden walls. Clara made to fetch water, but his hand touched her wrist, lightly, holding her still. The small gesture froze her in place. She looked up, and for the first time she saw him not as a stranger cloaked in mystery, but as a man waiting, asking wordlessly whether he was allowed to cross this line. Clara did not pull back. Her breath came hard, yet her gaze did not turn away. Jonah leaned down slowly, step by step, until she could feel the warmth of his breath brush her skin. In that instant, she could have turned aside, but her heart kept her there. When his lips touched hers, all the caution, all the walls she had built for years, fell to pieces. The kiss was trembling, uncertain, like 2 parched souls finding water in the desert. Then it deepened, urgent, carrying both fear of loss and hunger to hold on to what had finally been found. Clara's arms rose around his neck, clinging to the solid line of his shoulders. Jonah gathered her close, his rough hand shaking as if afraid the moment would vanish if he let go. The firelight painted their shadows entwined on the cabin wall. No more distance, no more caution. Every kiss, every clasp of the hand was a silent vow. They found each other in hurried breaths, in the heat of skin, in that strange yet familiar sense that only comes when two wounded souls recognize one another. That night, what they shared was not only flesh, it was the surrender of two hearts once broken, the courage to step beyond fear. Clara closed her eyes, tears slipping free as Jonah's arms held her, not to possess, but to lift. He kissed away those tears, slow and reverent, as though afraid his roughness might harm something so fragile. Later, when the firelight had ebbed low, Clara lay still, her head resting on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the prairie wind howled across the roof, but within the cabin there was only the quiet of two breaths falling into one. In the flicker of shadow, Clara whispered, her voice breaking like a confession. "I cannot lose everything again." Jonah gave no answer. He only drew the blanket over them both and pulled her closer, silence pressing his vow more firmly than any words. That silence, solid, sure, unadorned, became the strongest promise Clara had ever received. That night on the porch changed everything. They were no longer two strangers sharing shelter, but two lives turning toward one another, even with ashes still scattered across the land they called home. Rumors rode faster than the wind in Redemption Ridge. Within days of the stable fire, whispers filled the marketplace, the saloon tables, even the pews of the church. Folks said Clara Monroe could not bear children, that Silas Granger had known it all along. That was why he left her. A woman without children has no use for land. A ranch without heirs is nothing but dead ground. Silas is right. Better he take charge than her. The words cut like blades. Clara walked down the main street, basket of greens in her arms, her steps faltering under every stare. They no longer looked at her as a failed widow, but as barren soil, a field that could never yield. Shame burned hot beneath her skin until she longed to run home, bolt the door, and never step outside again. Silas knew where to strike. He needed no proof, only a seed of rumor left for others to feed with their curiosity. And while the whispers grew, his lawyer filed papers in town. Silas was demanding the court declare Clara unfit to manage what land remained, that the rights to the eastern spring should pass to a man more worthy. That night, Clara sat frozen at the table, the court petition spread before her, the red seal gleaming in lamplight. Her vision blurred, the letters melting together. One hand rose to her belly, to the emptiness that had haunted her for years. Silas had turned her quietest sorrow into a weapon. The door creaked open. Jonah stepped in, his coat dusted from a day laboring at the ditch. He paused, eyes dropping to the papers. He needed no explanation. Clara turned her face, trying to hide the tears streaming hot down her cheeks, but her voice cracked, broken. "They say I'm worth nothing, Jonah, that this land doesn't belong to me, 'cause I can't give it a child." She bent over the table, shoulders shaking, the strength she had clung to unraveling in an instant. Jonah came forward. He did not rush to soothe with words. He laid his heavy hand on her shoulder, steady, holding it there until she finally lifted her face through tears. Only then did he speak, voice low and rough, like stone grinding. You don't need to prove a thing to anyone. Clara blinked through her confusion. Jonah sat across from her, his gaze locked, every word carved deep as if meant to outlast time. You keep this land not for a child. You keep it for your parents, for yourself. No rumor, no court, can strip that from you. His voice was not loud, but each word settled into her chest, pulling her free from the storm. Her tears came again, not of despair this time, but of release, of being seen, believed. Clara nodded faintly, like a child who had found her breath again after choking. Jonah reached across the table, closing his scarred fingers over hers where they clenched the wood. He did not let go until she squeezed back, her hand still trembling, but steadier. When the first hearing came, Clara entered the courthouse in a plain dress, her shoulders straight, though her heart thundered. Eyes followed her from every corner, curious, judgmental, waiting. In the back row, Jonah sat tall, his gaze fixed on her. With one glance toward him, Clara knew she was not alone. Silas stood across the room, his smile sharp, brandishing signed papers, calling her a woman with no future. With each word he flung, Clara pressed her hands together in her lap, drawing strength from the warmth she still carried from the night before. The warmth of Jonah's hand closing over hers like a vow. By late afternoon, the session adjourned. Clara left the courthouse, her steps dragging, but Jonah was waiting at the steps. He asked no questions, offered no rush of words. He simply held out his hand. Clara set hers in his, and the weight inside her eased. Together they walked back toward the ranch, their hands still clasped. What had begun in caution, what had deepened in a night of closeness, now stood firmer, an alliance, a bond forged not just in need, but in choice. And deep within, Clara knew, even if she lost the land, even if she faced every cruel whisper, one thing would remain untouched, a hand that would never let hers go. The afternoon at Redemption Ridge lay quiet, sunlight spilling gold across the fields, the scent of dry grass heavy in the air. But that day, a dust cloud rose on the road to Clara's ranch. The pounding of hooves echoed like war drums. Clara was sorting vegetables on the porch when she heard it. Her chest clenched, her hand gripping the basket until her knuckles ached. 6 riders came into view, their faces weathered by sun, their eyes hard. They were Silas Granger's men. Gun handles glinted in some hands, while others carried coiled rope ready for a show of force. Clara froze. Fear surged through her like floodwater. Then, behind her, Jonah Whitaker stepped out. He carried no weapon, only his frame and stride, slow, steady, unshaken, until he stopped at the ranch gate. The horses screamed as they pulled up, dust swirling thick, but Jonah stood solid, legs rooted, ash-gray eyes cold as steel. Clara saw his back straight and unbending, and strangely, her own fear loosened. The leader spat into the dirt, sneering. "Step aside, friend. We're here to remind the widow Monroe this land's not hers anymore." Jonah did not move. He blocked the gate, his voice low and graveled, carrying clear. "If you want in, you go through me first." The words were simple, no roar in them, but sharp enough to drive the riders half a step back. The air drew taut, stretched like a bowstring. Clara drew breath and stepped off the porch. Jonah turned his head as if to stop her, but she shook it once, firm. She came to stand at his side, their shoulders nearly touching. Her dark eyes burned, though her fingers clenched the hem of her dress to hide their tremor. "I'm not leaving," Clara said, her voice steady though quiet. "This is my land. You have no claim." The leader let out a shrill laugh. "Hear that? A woman bold enough to talk back." He nudged his horse forward, hand reaching for the gate chain. Jonah stepped up. One pace was enough to fill the space, his frame closing the gap. He didn't draw a gun. His eyes alone cut sharper than any blade. "Don't," he said. The silence after was heavier than threat. The yard stilled, broken only by the restless cries of horses and the whine of wind through the fence. Then came the sound of footsteps. Figures appeared on the road. Neighbors. The grocer's widow. The blacksmith. A farmer's family. They carried no arms, but stood at the edge watching. Silas's men shifted uneasily. They knew what it meant to be seen. In a small town, reputation weighed as heavy as bullets. To act now would be to brand themselves, and the tale would spread by dawn. The leader clenched his jaw, reins twisting in his fist. "We'll be back, and next time it won't just be fire." He jerked his head. The riders wheeled their horses, a storm of dust rising, then thinning as they disappeared down the road. Jonah did not move until their tracks had faded from sight. Only then did he breathe out, his shoulders easing. Clara looked at him and saw his hand still clenched tight, as if unwilling to let go of the fight. Gratitude swelled sharp in her chest. The neighbors did not cross the fence. They only gave nods, silent, before turning back to town. Yet the look they left behind said enough. For the first time, Clara felt the town's gaze shift, not wholly in her favor, not yet, but no longer against her either. Something had stirred. On the porch, Clara sank onto the steps, her breath ragged. Jonah followed, lowering himself beside her. He spoke no words. He only set his rough palm over hers, letting the silence bind them closer than any speech. The storm at Redemption Ridge had broken across their doorstep. It was not over. But Clara knew this much. She was no longer fighting alone. And from that stand, the town no longer saw a failed widow and a nameless drifter, but two souls who dared to hold their ground before their own door. After the standoff at the ranch gate, Clara thought Silas might step back, at least for a while. But Jonah knew better. "He's never known when to stop," he said quietly, his gaze on the prairie awash in golden dust. His voice carried no drama, only the certainty of a man who had lived too long among dangers not easily named. Clara's hands twisted together in her lap. "What will we do? He won't give up?" Jonah turned, ash-gray eyes hard as iron. "We'll let him think he's already won. When he's most sure of himself, that's when he'll show his true face." She stared at him, torn between doubt and faith. Jonah was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, each one fell like a stake driven into earth. The next day, Jonah walked into the saloon, where curious eyes followed him. He sat across from Silas, voice low and graveled. "I don't plan to stay long at the ranch. If you want the land, maybe I can convince Clara to move on." The room buzzed with whispers. Silas leaned back, lips curling into a wolf's grin. He clapped Jonah's shoulder like a man celebrating a victory already won. "Good, but she'll need to go soon, and I've got a way to make it quicker." His eyes gleamed with greed. "Tomorrow night, there won't be a stable left. No stable, no stock, no stock, no reason for her to cling to the land." Jonah drank deep, gave a slow nod, as though in agreement. But behind his steady gaze, a flicker of cold light burned, one Silas never noticed. That evening, Jonah sought out Deputy Harris, an older lawman he had once known. Harris was fair-minded, tied close to the people of the town. When Jonah laid the story before him, Harris frowned, then gave a grim nod. "If I see it with my own eyes, there won't be a soul who can deny it. I'll be there." The plan was set. Jonah returned to the ranch and told Clara the next night would bring danger. She paled, trying to stop him, but he rested a heavy hand on her shoulder, voice low but unshakable. "Trust me." The following night, the sky lay dark and moonless, prairie winds wailing through the fences. Clara barely breathed, her pulse hammering. Jonah paced the yard, tall frame casting long shadows in the lantern light. Behind a thicket at the edge of the property, Deputy Harris crouched, revolver steady, his eyes fixed on the stable. Near midnight, shadows crept across the yard. 3 of Silas's men slipped forward, oil cans in hand, matches ready. Their hushed voices carried cruel laughter. "Burn it quick, and by morning she'll be gone." They splashed oil on the walls, struck matches that flared against the dark. Clara gripped the table inside the cabin, her heart a wild drum. Jonah's hand rested over hers, for calm, his finger to his lips. The fire licked high, only for Harris to burst from the dark, voice booming above the wind. "Stop! You're caught in the act!" The men stumbled back, panic flashing. Before they could run, Harris leveled his revolver, blocking their way. Jonah stepped forward, his presence filling the yard, voice cutting through like a blade. "This time, everyone saw what you tried to do." And indeed, lanterns glowed beyond the fence. Neighbors Jonah had quietly asked to watch now approached, their lights throwing stark truth across the saboteurs' faces. There would be no denial. The night ended with ropes binding the men's hands. Harris, grim but resolute, clapped Jonah's shoulder. "You were right. Silas can't wriggle out now." Clara stood nearby, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. Tears broke loose, not from fear but from release. She turned to Jonah, her voice little more than a whisper. "You thought of everything." Jonah said nothing. He only met her gaze, his gray eyes softening. She saw in him not only the strength to defend her, but the patience to outthink those who sought to destroy her. On the porch, with ash still drifting on the wind, they stood side by side. The lantern glow cast their shadows as one against the cabin wall. No words were needed. Clara understood now. Her trust in Jonah had reached its full measure. For the first time in years, she had not only a man who cared for her, but a true ally. A wall of stone beside her, to face whatever storms still gathered on the horizon. That morning, Redemption Ridge woke to an air heavy with expectation. Before the sun climbed high, the church bell tolled across the prairie, its steady clang summoning the whole town from their homes. Along the dirt road leading to the square, people gathered in clusters. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, farm wives, all drawn as if to a grand play about to unfold. The word had spread for days. The sheriff would hold a public hearing over the land dispute between Clara Monroe and Silas Granger. But everyone knew it was more than land. It was the collision of 2 lives, a widow long scorned, and a man who had once ruled the town by cunning and fear. Clara entered the square. She wore a plain dark blue dress that clung to her slender frame, her hair pinned neat though a few curls escaped to dance in the morning wind. Her eyes held strain, but her steps fell firm on the earth. Her hand trembled until Jonah moved beside her, his grip steadying hers. "You're not alone," he murmured, his voice a weight anchoring her against the swell of fear. On the courthouse steps stood Silas. His coat was pressed, his hair slicked back, a smirk carved on his lips. He looked at Clara the way a predator sizes its prey. But behind him, the sheriff and Deputy Harris appeared, carrying a bundle of papers, and leading 3 of Silas's men, bound tight with rope. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the air thick enough to feel in the lungs. The sheriff raised a hand, calling for quiet. His voice carried deep and sure. "Today we hear the matter of the Eastern Tract at Redemption Ridge. But before the court decides, certain evidence must be shown." Deputy Harris stepped forward. He told clear and plain how he had seen Silas's men setting fire to the stable with his own eyes. Witnesses came forward, neighbors who had stood watch when Jonah called them. Then Harris held up a pair of boots tarred with pine pitch, their soles matching the tracks found by the barn. Each word, each piece of proof, drove a stake through Silas's claim. The crowd stirred. Some who once praised Silas now looked away, uneasy. His face paled, but he masked it quickly with a sneer. "Lies," he snapped. "A few reckless hirelings mean nothing. Their mistakes are not mine." Jonah stepped forward. His gaze was cold as ash, his voice steady. "They named you, and everyone here knows no man in Redemption Ridge would dare move in against that land without Silas Granger's command." His words rolled across the square, and heads began to nod. Silas flushed with anger, lips parting to lash back. But then Clara advanced. The crowd hushed to silence. A black woman, once mocked and disregarded, now stood straight as any pillar, her eyes burning with resolve. She drew breath, her voice clear, unwavering. "For years I kept silent, so people would think me weak. I endured so no one would know what he did, stealing the land my parents left, abandoning me to ruin, spreading poison that I was unworthy to keep my home. But today I will not stay silent." She clenched her fists, pressing on. "This land does not belong to Silas. It belongs to my parents, to my hands. He may call me by any name he chooses, but he cannot strip away this truth." For a heartbeat, no sound stirred. Then, from the back of the crowd, the old blacksmith's voice rang. "She's right." The grocer's widow nodded firmly. "We've all seen what she's done to keep that ranch alive." One by one, voices rose, catching like sparks in dry grass. In moments, the square erupted. Applause thundered, shouts of support rising high, echoing off the wooden walls. Clara stood among them, tears streaking her cheeks, but her smile shone fierce and proud. For the first time in years, she was no longer the broken widow in their eyes, but a woman recognized, her truth ringing loud. Silas screamed, his voice shrill, but his words drowned in the roar of the crowd. The sheriff lifted his hand, and 2 deputies closed in. "Silas Granger, you are charged with inciting arson and endangering lives. You'll be held for trial." Silas thrashed, hatred blazing in his eyes, but no one cared. The power he once wielded crumbled beneath the weight of scorn. The people no longer feared him. They despised him. Clara turned, meeting Jonah's gaze. He gave a single nod. No words passed, but none were needed. In his eyes, she saw it plain. Her path forward was no longer the same. Not only because Silas had fallen, but because she herself had risen, spoken, and been answered by the town at last. The prairie wind swept across the square, lifting dust into the light. And in Clara's chest, for the first time in many years, the world glowed like a new dawn. In the days after the public hearing at Redemption Ridge, the town no longer felt the same. The heavy silence that once trailed Clara wherever she walked had shifted. Now, as she passed along the dusty street, some lifted their chins in quiet greeting, others offered a small smile, eyes softer than before, as if confessing they had judged her wrongly for far too long. Clara was not accustomed to the change, but deep inside she felt a weight lift, like a heavy cloak slipping from her shoulders. The Monroe Ranch, too, stirred back to life. The old stable still reeked of smoke, its skeleton charred black, but beside it rose the beams of a new frame, sturdier than the last. Clara planted tender bean shoots along the fence, her hands stained with earth, though her eyes brimmed with hope. On the porch, Jonah replaced weathered boards, each strike of the hammer like a heartbeat mending the home. That evening, with the sun spilling red across the plains, Clara sat down on the steps. The wind carried scents of fresh grass and damp soil, laced with the chorus of cicadas. Her chest felt calm, not because fear had vanished entirely, but because for the first time she had someone to lean on. Jonah returned from the shed, shirt darkened by soot, his rough hands streaked black from the forge. He lowered himself beside her, saying nothing, letting the evening wind and the sound of insects fill the silence. Clara glanced at him, beads of sweat still clinging to his temple, and for a fleeting moment her hand lifted, wishing to brush it away. But her fingers froze halfway, lingering in the air. After a long pause, Jonah opened his hand. Resting in his scarred palm lay a ring, iron hammered by his own hand. It caught the fading light, not smooth nor polished, its surface marked by dents and ridges. Its imperfection was its strength, carved from the life he had lived. Clara's breath caught. Her heart tightened, not with surprise, but with the weight of knowing what he placed before her. It was more than a ring. It was a life scarred by hardship, and the piece of his future he wished to give her. He drew in a slow breath, voice low but firm against the breeze. Clara, I don't have much to offer. Only these hands, and whatever days remain to me. But if you'll have me, I want to keep this land with you. Keep this home, not as a guest, but as your husband. Clara lowered her eyes to the ring, her chest heaving like waves rising against a shore. The wind tugged at her curls, but her gaze stayed locked on his hand. For a moment, Silas's face flickered in her mind. The lies, the humiliation, the nights of loneliness. Then she looked at Jonah, a man of few words, who had promised her nothing gilded, but had stood before storms, and now sat beside her, offering her the plainest, truest gift. A slow smile spread across Clara's lips, not the trembling smile of a woman in tears, but the steady smile of one who has found where she belongs. She placed her mouth, hand in his, squeezed gently, and spoke in a voice soft but clear enough for the wind to carry. Yes, I will. Jonah bowed his head and slid the ring onto her finger. The band was rough, a little loose, but on her hand it shone brighter than gold. It was not simply a token, it was a marker. From this day, they were no longer two wanderers seeking shelter, but one home, one family. They did not fall into each other's arms, nor weep as stories often tell. They simply sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch, eyes turned toward the endless prairie. The sun fell in a blaze of crimson, wrapping them in a light as warm as a silent blessing. In that quiet, Clara heard her heartbeat slip into rhythm with Jonah's. She knew then their love was no longer the wild fire that had blazed in the cabin, but the steady dawn that endures. Not a flame that consumes, but a warmth that lasts. Enough for her to know she would never walk alone again. That summer, Redemption Ridge was reborn. With the shadow of Silas Granger lifted, the town began to stir like green shoots breaking through cracked soil. Along the main street, new cabins rose with bright red roofs gleaming in the sun. The forge rang all day beneath Mr. Baker's hammer, iron striking iron with the steady beat of a heart awakening. At the corner of the square, a small schoolhouse of pale pine filled with the murmur of children learning letters beneath the bright morning light. On the land once dismissed as barren, the Monroe Ranch had risen strong. The rebuilt stable stood sturdy, roof tight against storm and rain. The fences stretched straight, each pale plank a mark of diligence. To the east, a field of young grain waved green, whispering like a hymn of gratitude. Every dawn, the yard came alive with crowing roosters and the rhythm of hooves against hard earth, all weaving into the sound of a life reclaimed. Clara Monroe had changed. The woman who once lowered her eyes in fear now walked with her shoulders straight, her gaze steady, her voice sure. On the porch, she sat at the long table with her eldest boy. His skin was light, his curls unruly, his eyes a soft gray that held both hers and Jonah's. Patiently, Clara traced her finger along the lines of an old book, her voice gentle but firm. Mo. There. Land. Ezra spelled slowly, lips pressed tight in concentration. Clara smiled and brushed a curl from his forehead. That's right, Ezra. You read it true. His eyes shone as he hugged the book to his chest like treasure. Clara's heart swelled with pride. These words were more than letters. They were a bridge. She knew the true inheritance of a family was not only land, but love and knowledge carried forward. In the yard, Jonah Whitaker held the reins of a gentle horse in one hand and the tiny fingers of their youngest in the other. He guided her step onto the stirrup, showed her how to balance on the saddle. Her laughter rang clear, scattering the last echoes of sorrow from the past. From the porch, Clara watched, her chest rising with a tender, fierce ache. Jonah, once a shadowed figure from the road, was now the anchor of her home. He spoke little, but with his steady presence and weathered hands he had turned ashes into life. By evening, the family gathered on the steps. The sun sank low, painting the prairie in fire orange. Shadows stretched long, merging the family into one silhouette across the ground. Jonah cradled Ezra on his knee, while Clara held their little girl close, her hair spilling across her mother's chest. They sat without words, gazing at the prairie where the wind moved like a lullaby. On the porch post hung a new wooden sign, the scent of fresh pine still sharp. The carving, rough yet deep, read, "Love chosen, not forced, endures all storms." Clara reached out, fingertips brushing the grooves, as if touching the story of her own life. Those words were more than a reminder. They were the sum of all her losses, her defiance, her choices. Once cast aside, mocked, left to ruin, now she stood loved, respected, with a legacy worth handing down. Her eyes met Jonah's. He nodded, the rare edge of a smile softening his face. In that look, both saw the path behind them, dark nights, raging fire, and the gentle dawn that now lay ahead. As night drew its veil, The sound of children's laughter rose from the cabin. Clara lingered on the porch, the cool wind in her hair, brushing her cheek. She closed her eyes and let the calm settle. She was no longer a widow in disgrace, no longer a woman abandoned in storm. She was Clara Monroe, mother, wife, keeper of a home built not on fear, but on choice. Inside, Jonah's low laugh blended with their children's voices, a music of belonging. Clara opened her eyes to the dark prairie. The wooden sign caught the young moon's glow, shining like a beacon for the days ahead. The circle had closed. Out of ashes, they had built a life. From the woman left behind, Clara had become the one who led, who chose, and was chosen. Their inheritance was not only a ranch made whole, but proof that love chosen freely can weather every storm. And so Clara Monroe's story settled into the gentle light of a prairie evening. From a woman abandoned, shamed beneath the eyes of her neighbors, she had risen, stood tall, faced the town, and at last found her home. One chosen by love, not dictated by force. The final image was not of battle or tears, but of a family on their porch, quiet, gazing at the open horizon. And the wooden sign, plain yet steadfast, bore witness beneath the pale moon. Love chosen, not forced, endures all storms. For many of us, especially those who have lived more than half a lifetime, this tale is no distant fable. It carries echoes of our own years, times of being misunderstood, abandoned, close to breaking. Yet by patience and by faith, we rose, and what we found was never gold nor land, but true love and the shelter it gives. Clara did not triumph by power or cunning, but by steadfastness and kindness. Jonah was no shining hero, but with scarred hands and quiet loyalty, he became the wall that sheltered their home. Two lost souls in the end found each other. That is the comfort for every heart once broken. Somewhere, someone waits to be chosen, and to choose us in return. Dear friends watching this story, perhaps you too have known loss, long winters of the soul. But believe this, like Clara, each of us may still find a new spring if only we keep kindness and courage alive. If this story touched you, leave us a comment. Share the moment that moved you most, or a memory from your own journey that it recalls. Each voice here turns these tales from stories into a gathering place for hearts. Please press like to show your support. Subscribe to walk with us, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next of our Wild West love stories. Every view, every share, every word you leave helps these gentle stories live on in the hearts of many. Thank you for your endurance through storms and for still choosing love.